Why is Latin America so poor? You can drive south from San Diego, one of the wealthiest cities in the richest country in the world, and within minutes of crossing the border, pass through neighborhoods crisscrossed by dirt roads with open sewers and houses made out of old plywood. It's two different worlds right next to each other, but separated by barriers made of concrete and steel. How is that even possible? On the American side, the household income is 8 times higher. People live almost 10% longer. Now, there are nice parts of Mexico, but south of the border, infant mortality is twice as high. And most adults, they don't even have a bank account. Their murder rate is 4 times higher than the United States, which really isn't even a low-crime country. So, what happened? Latin America has great natural resources and farmland, and the gap isn't explained by geography or genetics. The raw ingredients for wealth are all there, but the wealth isn't. I'm Ken LaCorte. I dig into uncomfortable questions, and I try to give you honest answers instead of polite ones. For this video, the answers involve history, culture, policy, and choices that are still being made today. And there's no easy villain that lets everyone off the hook. We'll work this through in 3 parts, starting with the legacy of colonialism and what that left behind. Then we'll look at its replacement, which in many ways became independence without order. And finally, we'll look at how the rule of law permeates everywhere through a society's economy. So, for 300 years, Spain ran Latin America. A lot of people blame them and the legacy of colonization for what happened, and there's a decent amount of truth to that. First, though, let's look before the Spanish showed up, because Latin America wasn't an empty wasteland waiting to be discovered. The Aztec, Inca, and Maya, they were some of the largest and most sophisticated civilizations on Earth at the time. They had huge cities. The Aztec capital in Mexico was larger than any city in Europe in the 1400s. They had complex economies and agriculture systems that fed millions of people with sophisticated irrigation, terraced farming, and crop rotation. By the standards of the day, they were massive and often pretty wealthy. But it wasn't a nirvana. Most of these were tough, brutal regimes. The Aztecs kidnapped their neighbors and forced them into slavery, or sometimes had their beating hearts cut out as sacrifices to the gods. The Incas' governing tactics? The state owned nearly everything, controlled the distribution of food and labor, and even told people what color of clothing to wear. Everyone worked in a system where power was concentrated at the top and the rest were told what to do. Not that the conquerors who replaced them were much better. But here's a critical difference between the colonization of North America and South America that I didn't understand until looking into this. The Spanish didn't come to settle. They came to plunder. They wanted to strip the gold and silver, then go back to Europe as wealthy men. And they took a lot. During that time, they extracted thousands of tons of silver from the region, about 80% of the world's total production over that period. Almost none of that stayed in South America, and it was one of the greatest wealth transfers in human history. Now compare that to North America. Britain's colonies didn't have mountains of silver to grab, so there was no easy extraction play. Colonizers there had to build functioning economies just to survive. Farms, trade networks, courts, local governments. The people who settled North America went there to create a new life, not just to get rich and go home. So before we talk about the legacy of the Spanish economic model, there's another factor we need to get into that made everything worse, and it doesn't get enough attention. Disease. Epidemics of smallpox, typhus, influenza, and more. They swept the Americas following European contact, killing between 10 million and 100 million people. Estimates range from 50% to 95% of the indigenous population. The native people of the Valley of Mexico dropped from 1.5 million people in 1519 to about 70,000 by the mid-1600s. And some Spanish Caribbean islands were just wiped out. Think about what that does to a society. The farmers, the engineers, the administrators, the people who know how to make the irrigation systems work. They were gone in short order, and the population levels in some regions didn't recover until the middle of the 1900s. Those Aztec and Inca empires were functionally destroyed not by Spanish military genius, but by biological annihilation. The Spanish conquered the remains and then built their colonial system on top of the wreckage. And then there's the matter of religion. In 1904, German sociologist Max Weber published an interesting book arguing that there was a deep connection between Protestant Christianity and the rise of capitalism. Protestants believed in predestination, that God had already determined who was saved, and over time they began looking for signs of that salvation in worldly success. Profit and material achievement became evidence of God's favor. Work hard, save, reinvest. And as it turns out, the Protestant work ethic is a pretty good way to build a solid economy. The Catholic Church, it offered something different. Salvation through sacraments and submission to church authority. Your fate in the next world wasn't tied to your productivity in this one. Now, that may be the recipe for a good life, maybe a good eternal life, but not as much for a wealthy one here on earth. Weber's thesis is deeper than that, and it's been debated and picked apart ever since. But there are a lot of correlations between wealth and the two religions that start to look like causation. To me, it certainly looks like a contributing factor. Okay, so those who blame a lot of Latin America's problems on colonization often point out that the systems built by Spain created inequality from the very beginning. And they're right. The conquistadors got massive land grants and the labor of everyone living on it. So a tiny elite owned nearly everything. There was no broad class of small independent farmers or landowners, no tradespeople building their own shops. In the United States and Canada, the middle class became the engine of growth and the foundation of democratic stability. In Latin America, that just didn't happen. But before we get too hardcore about the Spanish, now the story gets a little complicated, because colonial history alone doesn't answer everything. In other parts of the world, we routinely saw societies overcome colonial setbacks pretty quickly. In the 1950s, South Korea, coming out of Japanese colonialism, was really poor. Today, it's a wealthy, advanced country with a per capita income on par with much of Europe. Singapore is another great example. It was a poor port city with essentially no natural resources, colonized by the British, and handed its independence with almost nothing. When I was born, its GDP was comparable to Ghana. Today, it's one of the wealthiest places on earth. The pattern is real, and you can see it. Countries that built functioning institutions and open economies, they caught up to and sometimes surpassed their former colonizers. Countries that didn't, they stayed poor regardless of their colonial history. So the colonialism argument isn't wrong, but it's only part of the picture. But maybe the worst thing that Spain left behind wasn't poverty, but it was a model of power that said laws are for other people and wealth belongs to whomever holds the power. And when they left, the model didn't change. It just got new management. Why didn't it start thriving when the Spanish pulled out in the early 1800s and turn into a continent full of Singapores and South Koreas? After independence, there were 16 new countries with natural resources and good farmland. And there were millions of people looking to build something new. But it became independence without order. The failures weren't immediate. In fact, the early post-independent decades looked pretty promising, especially in the southern cone of South America. By the 1880s, Argentina was genuinely wealthy. Not developing nation wealthy, but really wealthy. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America, and it wasn't hyperbole. By 1913, Argentina's per capita GDP was higher than France, Germany, or Italy. Uruguay wasn't far behind, and Chile was raking in money from mineral deposits. A lot of people thought the Southern Cone was on its way to becoming another United States or Australia. Then the wheels came off. The problem was structural, and it started with something boring but lethal. The economies were built almost entirely on commodity exports, like Argentinian beef, Chilean copper, or Brazilian coffee. When global demand was high, things were great. When it dropped, and it always does, the governments couldn't pay their bills, and debt crises became the norm. Foreign investors pulled out, local currencies collapsed, the booms were spectacular, and the busts were terrible. And they repeated and repeated. That chaos affects people psychologically. When your savings evaporate twice in a generation, you stop trusting the systems. You also support politicians who say they'll fix it fast. And through the cycles, The politicians who promised stability and prosperity were replaced by other politicians promising the same. And sometimes they were replaced by generals who promised stability and no politics at all. Between 1930 and 1980, Latin America saw more than 70 successful military coups. And yes, some of those involved the United States, although they were a small fraction overall, but they were concentrated in the biggest, most strategically important countries. That instability whacked economies. I mean, to make both small and large businesses work, you need to believe that a contract signed today will still be valid in a few years, that the rules won't change mid-game, and that the person you're dealing with will still be around. Latin America offered none of that. So serious long-term investment, it went elsewhere. And even for honest politicians who held power, they knew that that was likely temporary. So that means you're not thinking about 20-year infrastructure projects. You're thinking about how to solve the immediate problems before someone else takes your job. And the temptation for easy fixes can go really bad. One temptation is nationalization. When you see an ongoing, successful business, you take it over for the people. Venezuela is a great example. When Hugo Chavez took power in 1999, Venezuela controlled more oil than any nation on earth. The state oil company had actually been competently run for years, but Chavez took control. He renationalized it, again, for the people. Then he ran it into the ground. After a strike, he fired 18,000 experienced employees and replaced them with political loyalists. He literally fired executives on TV, live. The new people in charge did all right for themselves, but they stunk at the oil business. So a company that once produced 3.5 million barrels of oil per day later struggled to produce 800,000. So if you ever wondered how a country sitting on more oil than Saudi Arabia goes broke, that's a little insight. Another easy temptation for politicians is trade protectionism. The logic sounds reasonable, and it's popular. Protect local industries with tariffs on imports so they can grow without foreign competition beating them up. The problem is that industries protected from competition, they just don't get better. Automobile tariffs in 1950s Brazil created a local car industry that charged people twice the world price for cars that were a decade behind in quality and technology. Local consumers paid the price, and the industry, it never had to get good because it never had to compete. Then there's the most dangerous, easy fix of all, printing money. When governments can't pay their bills, the printing press is right there, and it's painless until it isn't. And that pain is inflation. From one example of many, in 1985, Bolivia's inflation hit 23,000%. That means a cup of coffee that cost 1 peso would rise to 230 pesos in a year. Workers spent their salary the moment they got it because it lost value by the hour. Vendors stopped counting money. They started weighing it. High inflation, especially hyperinflation like that, doesn't just empty wallets. It destroys the social contract. And when that goes, governments usually follow. And I'm not talking about just a few random events. It became practically a Latin American tradition. Look, there have been thousands of books on the Latin American economy with different theories and statistics. If I've made a serious mistake, let me know and I'll fix it below. You can find my notes and my fact-checking documents down below there too. Okay, so all those easy fixes, the nationalizations, the tariffs, the money printing, they share one thing in common. They're government actions in systems where the rule of law is weak. That's not a problem you can fix with a few policy changes because it's a problem that took centuries to create. And when you trace it back, you can see the recurring theme of the caudillo, the strongman. After independence from Spain, Latin America didn't automatically transition to rule of law. It transitioned from one strongman to another. They operated in systems without too many formal rules after the colonial order fell. The guy with the army made the laws, and then he changed it whenever he felt like it. That means strong, independent judicial and political institutions never got created, because dictators don't need those. Let's look at a fairly simple but vital element that was missing: land rights. If your family's been farming a piece of land for generations but can't prove they own it, that means they can't use it to get a loan and buy a tractor instead of farming with an animal, or other machinery that can grow a small farm into a larger one. It's the same with homes. Without a legal title, a family can't use it as collateral for a loan, or sell it efficiently, or build a business on it. Peruvian economist Hernando de Soto spent his career documenting this, and he found that about 70% of the land holdings in Lima, Peru, lacked proper titles. It's what he called dead capital, locked out of the formal economy. And Lima isn't the exception, it's the rule across Latin America. The same dynamic plays out across the whole informal economy. A man opens a fruit stand or a small repair shop. No permits, no registration, no taxes. But he has to stay small and invisible or the government notices. So he can't hire employees legally, can't sign contracts, can't grow. From the outside, these economies look vibrant, but they're bound. The entrepreneurs don't lack ambition or ability. They're locked in a system where it's hard to grow. And when you combine a Cadillo mindset with rules that are haphazard, people stop believing those laws apply equally to everyone because they don't. Once that trust is gone, corruption becomes the norm. Heck, corruption becomes rational. I mean, if a government can take what it wants, why would you play by the rules that only you seem to follow? You bribe the official, you pay off the policeman, you cut a deal under the table, not because you're a bad person, but because that's just how things work. Look, in some countries, when you're driving and get pulled over by a cop, you don't pull your license out of your wallet, you pull out cash. Now, I've traveled a decent bit, and those places never have strong economies. Systemic corruption rots out the whole economic system, and the overlap between a corrupt society and a poor society, it's pretty much 100%. I could spend hours on this, from land rights to contract enforcement to so much more. Succeeding in a business is hard enough under the best of circumstances, but when the system isn't just, it can be overwhelming. I knew a businessman in a high corruption country that once he became successful, the mafia came looking for their share. And he couldn't call the police because there was a good chance they were in on it as well. His solution? Move to the United States, where he knew that he could work hard, build wealth, and not have it stolen away from him. And when they can, people often vote with their feet. 30 million Latin Americans have done just that. And it's not just the lower class people fleeing poverty. Mexico alone has lost over 1 million college graduates to the United States and Canada. A lot of people who fled are skilled professionals who want to thrive in a better system. In some Caribbean nations, about 70% of college-educated professionals leave, looking for better opportunities. And the people leaving? They're the exact people a country needs to fix itself. So it's a vicious cycle with no easy exits. So it's easy for an American to feel good, maybe a little smug, when we see those other countries. But the people on both sides of that border, they aren't that different. It's the systems they were born into, systems built centuries ago with decisions made by people who are long gone but still have consequences today. The concrete and steel separates one country that built institutions and prosperity from another that got caught in cycles that compounded into something else completely. Hey, thanks for joining me. I hope I did a fair job here and that you found it worthwhile. Until next time.